Welcome back. That's defendant's police interview. As you can see, the jury has to rehear the interview process of the defendant admitting to the murders. Remember, this is the case of Anthony Kirkland out of Ohio. It was a death penalty case. He was already found guilty and serving life in prison for 2 other murders. He is guilty of 5 murders. In this case, there's 2 more to consider. And the prosecution said that if he wasn't given the death penalty in closing arguments, that the other 2 murders, the murders of Sheree Crawford and Esme Kenny, would be considered freebies. With me, Brad Micklin, trial attorney. Let's dissect this for a minute and talk about why. Okay, another thing to point out, just for the viewers, this is a different jury, but the same prosecutor. So the prosecutor that was found of misconduct in the first case is now going for the death penalty again in the second case, but it's a different jury. And this jury is not the jury that actually found him guilty of the murders. This is a rehearing of just the death penalty. So now the jury has to rehear all the facts and evidence all over again. Why is that important for a death penalty hearing?
Well, I think it's important because every aspect of a death penalty case has really heightened scrutiny, from the beginning appointment all the way to the sentencing. And here we have a case that was returned by the appellate division, actually was first denied and then reconsidered and then returned. So there are a lot of people that have a lot of interest in making sure this case gets done right. First of all, of course, the prosecutor, but then we have all the victims' families and all the relatives and friends and everybody that's getting involved. All of these years are part of the trial that we're now trying to conclude for once.
And do you think it's necessary for a serial killer of this magnitude, who's been, or he's admitted 5 killings, to have to go through a sentencing rehearing real fast? We have to take a quick break. Yes or no?
Well, unfortunately, yes, because the appellate division said so, but I don't think so. When you have 5 murders, there's no question.
Right. It seems like there's no question. Seems frivolous, but due process of law is important. We must take a quick break. Stick with us, and we'll be right back live in the courtroom. Welcome back. This is the death penalty sentence rehearing for Anthony Kirkland out of Ohio. This is the case where the serial killer was convicted and sentenced to death in 2010. But because the prosecutor said in closing arguments that even though he was already sitting in prison for 2 other murders, life in prison, that if they didn't find him guilty and sentence him to the death penalty, that the second set of murders, there's 5 total, would be considered freebies. With me, Brad Micklin, trial attorney. Let's talk about this. Right now we're listening to some draconian testimony of the police interview where he's walking through the admission of these murders. Why is it important that the jury hears these admissions blow by blow, even though we already know he's guilty?
Well, because again, this is a death penalty phase, so the important issues to establish are going to be aggravating factors.
Exactly. Like so aggravating and mitigating. So by explaining this, he's going into the jury is going to decide if it's aggravating, rather than the prosecution saying in closing arguments that this is aggravating, which is more conclusory. Right.
But also remember, at the time he's taking this interview, this is before all this has happened. You know, we sit here talking about the appeals and the hearings. It's all very intellectual. But this is earlier, when he's just getting the confession. And my understanding was Kirkland was in and out of questioning for many years on these murders. So I think it's very important at that point in time that they get the admissions and the statements very clearly on the record.
Right, and I think that's a good point, too. So for those of you just joining us, this was a 2010 sentence to death. We are now in 2018, 8 years later. So by replaying things that were fresh at the time, the jury gets to hear things from a perspective back then, even if the defendant were to take the stand and say anything fresh right now. We're going to continue monitoring this case closely in the courtroom with our live feed, but we must go to a quick break. But stay with us, and then we will go back into the courtroom when we return. Welcome back. You're watching the Anthony Kirkland trial out of Ohio. Now, you might be watching this and thinking, it's kind of boring to listen to all this testimony and this police interview being played. It glosses over the aggravating factors. I mean, imagine if this was actually really told and you were watching it as a movie, because this guy killed 5 people, and he is going through in a very dry manner 5 different murders as he admits them in this death penalty trial. With me, trial attorney Brad Micklin. Brad, let's discuss this. When we were on break, you and I were chatting together on set saying, you know, something that's actually rather colorful is kind of boring to listen to. We were thinking, what's the jury think about all this?
It's very trying. I mean, I think sitting on any jury is very challenging because while we get to see the exciting parts and the parts that go on Law&Crime are the exciting parts, there's a lot of monotonous testimony, there's a lot of downtime. So here we have people that are sitting listening to a recording because it's a new jury. And you're right, he's talking about, now I think we're on the third victim. And you hear things like how he dragged her, and that's compelling. But then you get into little things like what was she wearing and what time of the day it was. And it's very challenging, I think, to follow.
It's so easy to check out. I mean, it's so easy. I almost wish that the cameras were going not only to the transcript so we could understand and see, but to the jurors' faces as well so we could get perspective on what they're thinking and how they're actually digesting this. Because if this were a movie being replayed and enacted, there's no way that we wouldn't think that this had severe aggravating factors. You have a minor, you have minors, plural, you have arson, you have murder, you have serial murders, and then you have a very dry transcript recounting this to decide whether or not he should be found guilty of the death penalty or sentenced to death. We have to take a quick break, but then we're going to go back into the courtroom and have more in-studio analysis when we return. Stay with us. Welcome back. This is the Anthony Kirkland case out of Ohio, the death penalty resentencing. Remember, he was sentenced to death in 2010 after he was found guilty of a total of 5 murders. He's a serial killer. The prosecution said that if you don't sentence him to death on these last 2 murders, that they're basically freebies because he was already serving life in prison for the previous murders. With me is Brad Micklin, trial attorney. And Brad, we were discussing during, break and during while they're in trial how dry this sounds right now. But then we were going into the aggravating factors. And I think one thing to point out that the audience needs to know is that not only is this a serial killer with 5 victims, but there's a common theme. And what's that theme? They're all women. There's sexual assault involved in all of them. There's arson involved. And we're here listening. Oh, and there's minors. Okay, talk about aggravating factors. And here we are listening to a resentencing hearing of a death penalty case. Really?
You can't get around how gross these offenses were, and whether you're talking about aggravating or mitigating factors, there's no way to escape it.
It's so aggravating, though. How can this be mitigating?
I don't think you can.
The only thing to me that's mitigating when I listen to this is the fact that we're listening to a very dry transcript, and it'd be so easy to check out and not pay attention and catch these aggravating factors.
Well, but you also have to look at Ohio statute that will actually delineate which is and is not an aggravating factor, and most of them are. But I think the jury is going to have trouble separating them anyway.
Well, because the jury is human,
right,
and the jury is going to have their own human influence on this. The only disadvantage that the jury is going to have on this is the fact that they're not listening to the actual trial. They're listening to the resentencing, whereas the initial jury that sentenced him to death, they had the benefit of hearing the first trial and then sentencing to death based on that. We're going to go to a quick break and then go back into the courtroom live to listen to more of this police interview. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Law and Crime. I'm Carissa Kranz, and as usual, we are covering the country's biggest crime stories. And right now, we're going to go to Anthony Velez, who has our most trending top crime stories from around the country.
Here are today's top crime stories trending on lawandcrime.com and across the country. 2 opportunistic criminals were arrested for allegedly looting homes evacuated due to the car fire in California. 25-year-old Jay Ball and 19-year-old Jack Fannin were arrested after police found evidence tying the pair to several burglaries in Redding. The wildfire has destroyed over 650 homes and prompted the evacuation of thousands of residents. Ball and Fanning were charged with suspicion of looting in an evacuated area, entering a disaster area, and conspiracy to commit a felony. A woman in Arkansas was arrested after she allegedly told police she fatally shot her husband in a dispute over pornography. 69-year-old Patricia Hill allegedly killed her 65-year-old husband, Frank, after an argument about pornography he ordered via the television guide. Hill reportedly canceled the order, but Frank ordered another salacious video before his wife shot him 2 times. Hill was charged with felony probable cause for capital murder and will have her first court appearance next week.
I would kill your children first.
Really?
Yes, I would.
Okay.
A man in Canada is facing charges after video surfaced of a racist encounter where he threatened to kill an Indian man's family during a dispute outside of a Canadian Walmart. 47-year-old Dale Robertson was charged with dangerous driving and failing to remain at the scene of an accident after he hit the unidentified man with his car and threatened him in Stony Creek.
Canadian citizen.
Show me. Prove me. I don't believe you. You don't talk like a Canadian.
You don't like...
I don't. I'm racist this morning. I don't like you.
Authorities say Robertson might face additional hate crime charges. Those were today's top crime stories. I'm Anthony Velez for Law and Crime.
Thank you, Anthony. Wow, Brad. I mean, really, we're listening to these top crime stories and we're seeing road rage to a degree where someone is actually in a car running into someone over racist comments because they're outside of a Walmart. I mean, this is almost one step removed from the Demetrius Elder case we just got a verdict on, where road rage turned into a knife killing and a stabbing of six stab wounds with a fatal wound to the heart. What kind of world are we living in?
Yeah, it's a scary one. And remember, Elders was convicted not of manslaughter, but of
a misdemeanor. So for those of you just joining us right now and were watching us last week on the Demetrius Elder case, this is a case where someone was stabbed 6 times with a fatal wound to the heart. It was a Florida case. And the question was it self-defense or not? Someone died. A murder charge was brought in. Manslaughter. 30 years is what he was facing. And you know what the verdict was? A misdemeanor. A misdemeanor over road rage.
Well, I think it was because the passenger, Armando, I think, was still set to be tried, and he's probably the one who actually did the stabbing. At least he's the one, I think, that had the weapon on him.
Right, it's a co-defendant case. So, but in this case, I mean, literally, you're watching at the screen right now. It was one step removed from someone driving a dangerous instrumentality, a car, with an unarmed person outside of the car, and they're getting into a racist argument. Over what?
Well, I think that's the biggest part, is that the hate crime aspect is what's going to make this such a high-profile case. It's not bad enough that you have people getting out, yelling, assaulting, and risking harm to others, but then you add the added protection of the hate crime and the larger class that we need to protect against. And ultimately, I think we just need to have more messages so that this kind of behavior will stop.
Well, this kind of behavior is an epidemic because Demetrius Elder was in Florida and that case was in Canada. But you can always count on us at Law and Crime to cover the world's most top trending crime stories. Right now, we're going to go back to the story that we're covering now. It's our main trial. And yes, it's a story, even though it's in trial. It is Anthony Kirkland. He is guilty of 5 murders. Serial killer. All of them are women. There's sexual assault related in all of them. There's arson and burning. Tons of aggravating factors to consider, but the jury has to rehear whether or not he should be sentenced to death. So right now we're going to go back to the deposition of Lisa Kenny. She's the mother of victim Esme Kenny, one of the last victims that he killed. You're listening to deposition testimony of Lisa Kenny, the mother of Esme Kenny. That is a mother who is never going to forgive herself for not going with her daughter to go for a jog that day. 13 years old. She just wanted to go for a jog outside the house. She asked her mom to go, but the mom was too busy cleaning up drywall. This mother had a maternal instinct, and she will never forgive herself as you listen to that testimony. With me, trial attorney Brad Micklin. What are your thoughts about this, and what do you make?
Well, there's a lot. You know, I was first taken by how calm and cool she is when she's recalling this tragic story, because while all of them are tragic deaths, this was probably the worst and the youngest victim. But then I realized it's because she's been through it for so many years and probably told the story a dozen times that it's almost routine for her, and I think she's just trying to get through it.
Right, so she's trying to get through it, but the jury also needs to get through it, right? The jury needs to hear this because this goes to the aggravating and mitigating factors on whether or not the death penalty is an appropriate sentence. Right now, there's 2 victims for this trial, right? He's guilty of killing 5, but he's already serving life in prison for the others, and he was already out, before on another death that he caused, and then he went out and had 4 more murders. Serving life in prison on the others. Then there's these final 2. And right now the jury needs to be walked through this testimony with Esme Kenny, or the mother, Lisa, and the other victim, because the jury needs to decide, is this aggravating enough to have a death penalty sentence imposed.
Well, and I think this case and this testimony is probably the most important because while they're all gruesome, when you look at Ohio's aggravating factors, the age, I believe, for one of the factors is 13. So Cassandra was 14, but Esme was 13. So this is really crucial that the jury get to hear all of the factors behind this death.
Right. So even though 1 year off is considered not aggravating according to Ohio statute, like you said, you're still dealing with a 13-year-old and a 14-year-old,
Right.
which is, if anyone's human and they're sitting on that jury panel, they're going to say that's aggravating. Plus, they were sexually assaulted. Plus, they were burned.
Yeah, I don't think the
Plus, they were
jury is going to
killed.
be able to separate these factors and say, well, Cassandra was 14, so that's not an aggravating factor. I think when you murder and burn a 14-year-old, there's no way to escape that.
And you know, one thing I have to say that I think is a shame is the fact that our judicial resources need to be wasted to retry this when a guy like Anthony Kirkland is so guilty. He is so guilty. We know he did it, and he was sentenced to death, but we have to expend our resources because the prosecutor said one line passionately because he was upset.
There was actually several issues that the appellate division had with the prosecutor's statements. There may have been 3 or 4, but they were all just as small as this one. And I don't think even in the aggregate that they could have or should have remanded this for another trial, put all these families and victims through it again.
I totally agree they shouldn't have remanded it, but here we are, they remanded it, and now the victims are going through it again. A new jury who doesn't even get to hear the initial trial is going through a mini trial to decide the sentencing. And because of that, this guy, who is clearly a monster, may get away with these freebies after all, which the prosecution was that's why he got in trouble on the appeals, but that's almost unfair because as a prosecutor, I know when I was a prosecutor, I was so concerned with closing arguments because it's so easy to get a mistrial if you say one thing wrong when you're talking off the top of your head to try to piece it together for the jurors to make final argument. You have to piece together that narrative, and he pieced it together, but he made a conclusory statement, which then caused this whole trial to be reheard for sentencing.
And you can
Almost
understand
unfair.
that. I mean, if you're, as you said, you're a prosecutor. I never was, but I can.
Former, but
I
yes.
can't imagine that if you're facing a serial killer that you're trying to convict, you're going to be a little overzealous at moments. I don't think you can control it, but to return it for such what I think are benign statements was just ludicrous on the appellate division.
Yep, I totally agree. It shouldn't have happened, but it did, and that's our justice system. Next, we're going to go to Sergeant Jennifer Mitch, the Cincinnati Police Department, and listen to some of her testimony on why, this is prosecution trying to make its point, why Anthony Kirkland should be sentenced to death. Welcome back. I'm Carissa Kranz. You're listening to testimony from Sergeant Jennifer Mitch with the Cincinnati Police Department, and she is the responding officer discussing the DNA that she found on scene on the defendant, which links also to the victim, the final victim, Esme Kenny. With me, Brad Micklin. Why is this critical testimony? Why does the jury need to hear this in a sentencing phase of a trial? We already know he did it.
Well, a couple of reasons. One is, again, Esme is one of the most aggravating cases under the statute to go for the death penalty. But there was also a lot of controversy
Because
how
she's
the police
also
handled
13.
this. Right. But also there was controversy about how the police handled it as more of a missing persons and not an assault or murder. So I think you'll hear inside of this officer's testimony, there's a little bit of explanation. There's testimony about they didn't release the dog because they were afraid she was going to get bit. And I think they're really trying to justify some of their actions and some of their lack of actions so that there's not a lot of upset.
Well, and that's a good point, because there could always be a civil lawsuit that follows by the family or the mother saying that had the police responded properly, that her daughter may still be alive, which could be a money play for in the civil arena. Really interesting, testimony. We're going to continue to watch that. But Brad, I want to thank you so much for your time and joining us today. I know you have to sign off to go practice law.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
Yep, great to meet you.
You too.
Take care. Thank you, and we're going to continue to follow this live in the courtroom and continue to see what the jury will do. Will the jury sentence him again to death? He killed 5 people. It's an Ohio trial. Anthony Kirkland. The first jury sentenced him to the death penalty. Based on what the prosecution said in closing argument, the appellate court said that was not a fair trial, fair decision, and it was too prejudicial. So now we have a new jury deciding whether or not he will be found guilty and sentenced to death again. Stay with us.